Hello, I'm Shieldwall100 and welcome to my games channel. I've been away for almost a year now, I expect. Well, the short reason is I've become a father, and although I'm still gaming and painting and collecting, I just don't have time to set up, play, record and edit videos anymore. Something had to give, unfortunately, and I value my collecting and gaming time too much. One thing I do still do, though, is to roleplay with my friends, and I figured I would write a review of a scenario that my group has played through that is available on DriveThruRPG that I think more people should be aware of and, to my knowledge, has not been reviewed before. In Dark and Lonely Waters is a scenario for the Call of Cthulhu system, which I've become very familiar with as a keeper of arcane lore over the past year and a half. One important piece of reference material, I think, is compulsory viewing before we get deep into this. Some might say an elephant in the room, is that you should watch a short UK public safety film called The Spirit of Dark and Lonely Waters, which this scenario takes admitted inspiration from. You can find this film on YouTube and it supplies the tone marvellously. Now, this review will comprise of two overall sections. One, a spoiler-free discussion that will be suitable for players, and another more detailed section for those keepers amongst us, although I recommend keepers watch the first part as well to get introductory background on the adventure. The chief distinguishing feature for In Dark and Lonely Waters for both players and keeper alike is most likely going to be its setting, a council estate in the dark Thatcherite times of 1980s Britain. Nominally set in what my South Coast mind deems to be up north, you can really place the geography of the estate in many places of the country outside central London. I say this so you non-English players can feel free to bring out your best parody British accents and revel in everything from "one of the crossbeams have gone out askew on Treadle" to "it's Tuesday, innit?" As a player, you'll likely be given one of the pre-generated characters to use, unless such is anathema for your group, and you'll be glad to hear that they fit in quite well with the setting of putting a brave face on being disadvantaged. Experienced players will not find any nasty surprises in the list of skills that you'll be looking at. There's nothing, that you won't have seen before, and our group found that there are several ways to roleplay around the various situations that you'll find yourselves in. You'll be able to approach the majority of the obstacles to match your group's desired playstyle, and you'll be pleased to hear that a good keeper will have the latitude to accommodate this, as long as you're reasonable, of course. The setting places you as players as residents of the Carousel Farm housing estate, known colloquially as the Carry, and throughout this review I'll be referring to the estate as both, so get used to that. It's council-owned housing, isolated geographically by distance from more built-up areas, and isolated in terms of social standing by the ingrained attitude towards those in social housing of the British public and establishment. With limited opportunity for work and even more limited opportunity for escape, the player should be encouraged to adopt a mindset of resilience and self-reliance, as well as an inherent distrust of authority outside of what is provided by other residents of Carousel Farm. Despite the crime rate that accompanies areas of low employment and infrastructure investment, the residents of the Carry tend to look out for each other, and you as players can look to the locals as sources of support and information, with a little bit of smart roleplay to break down those initial walls of distrust. It's also fairly safe to say, as a non-spoiler reveal, that among the antagonists are the residents of the Bentford estate, which, in complete opposite to Carousel Farm, uses the word estate to encompass the land holdings of the rich and established Bentford family. Carousel Farm was indeed built upon land that was part of the Bentford estate and purchased off the latter many decades previously. Of course, the nobles of the Bentford bloodline and even their staff have absolute disdain for the residents of the former, who they see as far beneath them, even coining the term pigs or piggies to refer to them, and ensuring that the nickname stuck not just with them but surrounding towns, the local constabulary, and even amongst the residents of the Carry itself. This antagonistic attitude has by now been mirrored back towards the Bentfords, who have built a stone wall to keep the pigs in Carousel Farm away from what they see as true civilization. The best way to describe the geography is to imagine the original Bentford estate as a vast area of countryside, with the Carousel estate carving into a small but significant part of it, like someone taking a bite out of an apple, and the denizens of both sides of that wall resenting the presence of the other. Further causing bad blood between the nobility and the piggies was a series of accidental drownings that occurred within a large lake on the Benford estate some 9 years before the adventure is set. The victims were all children of Carousel residents, and so many accidents in such a short time turned grief to suspicion against the gentry who owned the area, and suspicion to outrage following the lack of police investigation, the deaths being downplayed as the follies of trespassing youths. The trauma of these drownings form part of the collective psyche of Carousel Farm, and all players, whether they be pre-generated or player-created, will be aware of them, likely as they are to have been school friends, or at least tangentially knowledgeable of the victims. Now, that's about as far as I can go into the background of the investigation without giving too much away. However, I can say that as a keeper, and my players found this a refreshing change of pace and setting from our usual Call of Cthulhu games. There's scope in here for encounters both supernatural and mundane, and for you to approach these and the mystery with a variety of methods to solving it. If you find yourselves finishing a session and your keeper asks for suggestions, you could do worse than asking him to check out this scenario, or pointing him towards this review and to stick around for the part that follows this. Now get out of here, lest ye be spoiled and have your fun ruined. Okay keepers, I hope it's just you and me now. There's lots to get into here, and I hope I can help you get the best out of this scenario, or at least help you determine whether this is a good fit for you and your group. The background to this scenario is laid out for us in detail, I'm glad to say. In times before humanity evolved, one of the great mythos gods, doesn't mention which one, tasked one of its subordinate beings, or maybe a collection of beings, known as the Stagnant Tribunal, with watching over the development of mankind in order to ensure they developed into worship of this god. The Stagnant Tribunal, with many planets and presumably dimensions to monitor, in turn created an entity called Taleb Zal, to stay on the young planet Earth and guide where need be. In an attempt to adapt to its home, Taleb Zal took on features necessary such as lungs, a stomach and eyes, and it found it needed to feed. Unfortunately for Taleb Zal, it turns out that nomming down on early life forms was a bit too much interference for its masters to tolerate, and the Stagnant Tribunal banished it to the bottom of a deep body of water, there to drown but not to die for all eternity. Tough gig. This body of water would turn into the Benford Lake, which has depths as yet unplumbed by human knowledge, and the anguish and spite felt by Taleb Zal has leaked into the water and the area surrounding, having a corrupting effect on the life in the water and the minds of those settling nearby. Transporting us to the time the scenario is set, we find that the Benford family has established a cult worshipping the entity in the water, what they call the Drowning Apostle, and have made use of the unwelcome presence of the carry as a source of human materials for the various torture and mutilation rituals they conduct to empower Taleb Zal, and through the entity, themselves. The series of drownings I mentioned earlier came from the Drowning Apostle freeing itself to run amok within the lake, necessitating its capture by the cult. However, within the past 2 or so days, an accident occurred in Benford Manor which has seen it freed again, leading to more deaths as it flexes its freedom once more. The scenario takes place over roughly 3 days, a long weekend if you will, starting on Friday evening in October as the players hang out socially. The interactions that are suggested in this first section work best if the characters your players are using are assumed to know each other well enough to have arranged to meet up socially anyway. Trust me, there's enough NPCs that can be introduced on the Friday night section that having the players need to become acquaintances as well might make later sections sound a bit forced, as these strangers continue to meet up and go off to solve a mystery. It's a role-playing thing, I know, but it might just be easier this way. There are 2 suggested social interactions that a keeper could go with to start the adventure, and I suggest enacting both of them unless you can think of something better. One of these is an interaction with 2, quote, lovable, unquote, little urchins called Warren and Terry, and the other is a visit to a social night at the Working Men's Club, which is being used for the annual fundraiser for the families of the children drowned 9 years ago. The interaction with Warren, and later his mum, helps give a tone for the type of people who reside on the estate. Meanwhile, the fundraiser gives a very handy opportunity to introduce the knowledge the players will have of the drownings, the collective trauma they inflicted upon the residents of the carry, and the lingering resentment towards those that live on the Benford estate. It's perfectly illustrated by the reception given to one Natalie Hampson, who, although is sister to the last victim, her family was taken in by the Bentford nobility after their family was shattered by the death, and is now seen as a traitor to her own kind, and is not at all welcome despite moving to the Bentford estate when she was just a little kid. Natalie has been drinking now, and is belligerent in her own right by what she sees as disrespect towards her sister, who was just as much a victim as either of the others. And if the players can calm her down sufficiently to talk to her, they can find what brought her what brought her to leave the estate, and plant the seeds of what will drive the investigators towards the mystery. Friday night will end with the police being called to a river leading through a local fishing spot, and keepers should find a way to make investigating this as very tempting for the players. I'm not suggesting railroading them, but honestly Friday night becomes a bit of a damp squid without them going to take a look. It transpires that a local fisherman has drowned while out with a couple of friends that evening, and while the police cordon off the area and start an investigation, a collection of Carousel Farm residents, including the players, grows into a crowd. The crowd of onlookers should start to turn mean as time goes on, calling on the police to do a good job this time and bring the Bentfords in, or just to clear off altogether, highlighting again how used the carry is, to being let down by the establishment. I had the detective in charge pick out dissenting figures in the crowd to his constables and order them to bring them in for a kick-in. Bear in mind this was the 1980s and poor areas would not have had the support of public when it became to police brutality. Meanwhile, I had the residents of the carry block the way to the targets of the detective's ire, enabling the individuals concerned to make a quick exit before they got collared. It was a nice little way to further demonstrate the lack of trust between police and resident, and how the residents look after their own. Attending here and gathering what information they can from the locals and scene will give the players useful information to go on the following day, and leaves the first night on a lovely murder by way of bringing some actual horror into the story. The players will also have an opportunity to meet the pompous Detective Inspector Craven, as well as the arrogant and sadistic Phillipson brothers, who the players should become well aware of in advance of getting to the end of the adventure. Saturday is a day of following up on leads and finding new ones, and there are several that you can go on that I will leave for you to decide which you wish to pursue as a keeper. They're not all compulsory, or not at all compulsory, and you can enforce a time limit as to what's capable to be done during the course of a day, for example, on proceedings to suit the circumstances of your group. Your players will meet a few more Carousel Farm residents of various community standing and uncover more of the unsavoury history of the Bentford estate's predations against them. As an example of how I started the second day, which also happened to be the start of our second gaming session for this adventure, I had the investigators agree to meet at the community centre before the weekly community roast dinner. I suggested that one investigator would be there from early on, helping to set it up, and the other players would be there on the way there. Starting with one of the travelling players, I had them arbitrarily stopped by police officers fishing for drugs, and before they began to get too physical, they were interrupted by the arrival of my second investigator, who reminded them of their obligations. Again, this was world building the life on one of the council estates that I thought would be a way of showing rather than telling. Furnished with information from people who knew the earlier drowning victims, someone who was out fishing with the prior night's victim, and an assortment of folks older than the players who have more experience of dealing with the Bentfords and that estate, the players should start to get the feeling that what is happening now is a part of what has been plaguing the carry for decades, and they'd be right. This can then bleed into Sunday morning, with more encounters as things start to ramp up and the investigators start following up leads that are more directly tied to the Bentfords, including potentially the local vicar, a cult member in charge of identifying vulnerable locals at his own parish, and a former groundskeeping assistant with his own notes on the cult. It should hopefully be clear that the players are heading for an excursion into the Bentford estate itself. However, as a keeper, I strongly advise an encounter early Sunday morning at the latest with one Harlow Mulvaney, a character I've not mentioned yet. He is a former employee of the Bentford estate who has gone rogue after uncovering too much of the cult practices there and stolen a book necessary to the successful containment of the drowning apostle. He is the reason for the increased police presence within the carry, and although terrified, he will accept the help of the investigators if it means he can get them to take over the reins for him. He will give the players the book he stole from the current Lord Brentford and then disappear, only to be seen later on in the scenario, dead as the horror ramps up. Another encounter that can be done quickly, and I recommend to do, is another meeting with a distraught Terry, who is out on the streets searching for his friend Warren. He last saw Warren jumping the wall onto the Brentford estate on Friday night and hasn't been home since. As Warren's only friend, Terry begs the investigators to look for him. This could be the deciding factor to prompt the investigators into decisive action, and Terry will further inform the investigators of the best place to jump the wall. So, here we come to Sunday evening, and the investigators using the cover of darkness to infiltrate the Brentford estate. I really like the symbology here that entering the estate, whether by physical means or trickery, is a point of no return, and players should easily pick up that they will not be getting any more help from the carry once they're inside. Even in the poor light of an autumnal England evening, you should really make the Brentford estate out as another world from what lies on just the other side of a high brick wall, as terraced houses and stray chip papers are replaced by woodlands and well-managed agriculture. Now, for you as keeper, the Brentford estate is the culmination of this adventure, and where it will sink or swim as an experience, so I recommend reading this section of the adventure carefully and planning on which parts your players will best interact with. Fortunately, there is a map included of the estate for your benefit, and it's pretty handy, although it would have been made better if it designated which point on the perimeter Terry marks out as being best for climbing over. There are several places mentioned as points of interest that you can take your players to, although the most important ones for successful resolution of the scenario are the lake and the manor. The lake being important so that the players can acquire samples of a specific flower that is mentioned in the book acquired from Harlow Mulvaney, and the manor because that is where the ritual can be performed that will enable the drowning apostle to be contained once again. The Brentford estate is a large section that can be expanded or compressed a great deal depending on your players. If approaching from the north, which is where I put my players, the lake is hard to miss, and so my players are able to go there and, after a brief attempt by the drowning apostle to pull one of them into the depths, some mornflower was acquired. It is at the lake where the body of poor young Warren is found, another victim of the drowning apostle only a day earlier, and the reason for the unusual bloom's presence, it only appearing in areas where death has occurred. After this, you can choose to play the Brentford estate as a tense game of cat and mouse between the players and the teams of armed groundskeepers patrolling the woods and pathways. Alternatively, you could have the players encounter particularly vicious livestock, driven into a rage by lack of food and the influence of the mythos. It's really up to you and your strengths as a keeper. Whichever you choose, try to keep the tension present as much as you can. The players are not welcome here, and everything should seem like a threat. There are certainly more buildings that you can place between the investigators and the manor house, and these should be made very clear as possible destinations as well, by way of them having clear interior lights on against the night sky, so they're visible even from a distance. I won't go into great detail, but the Hampson Apartments buildings contain lesser cult members who, having sensed that all is not well with their overlords, are making plans to cut and run. This can even turn into a small oasis of rest for your investigators. These are perhaps more victims of circumstance themselves rather than full-on villains. One building I heartily recommend guiding your players toward, and there are hints you can drop on Saturday and Sunday sessions leading up to the Brentford estate, is the Old Servants' Quarters. The Old Servants' Quarters is a 2-storey building in the centre of the estate and has been converted from its original use into the location where most of the cult rituals and business takes place. This being a Call of Cthulhu adventure, you are going to really want your players to take a look inside here. Inside the Old Servants' Quarters is any evidence needed to confirm once and for all that the Brentfords are participating in something truly awful. Now, this does lead into one of my few substantial complaints about In Dark and Lonely Waters, because although there is mention of what might be found within this building, including ritual rooms, torture rooms, etc., it would have been so much more useful if a simple map could have been given. Given it holds 3 hostile NPCs as well, those Phillipson brothers after they tortured and murdered Harlow Mulvaney, I thought it would be important to establish a map or layout so that I could gauge where my players were in relation to them, and so I created my own layout, and I'll show it here. Feel free to use this as inspiration for your own adventure if you need. Now, the Phillipson brothers are not in a frame of mind for talking and will be a stiff fight for your investigators, so depending on how much of a challenge you like to give your players, you might want to have the old servants' quarters contain either some weapons or some items that can be used as weapons. Having said that, the youngest of the brothers is terrified of his older siblings and can be persuaded to turn his back on them, although my players went in swinging while they had the element of surprise, so all that went out of the window. Another challenge you can throw at your investigators as they navigate the grounds is Samuel Moran, long-time head groundskeeper and firmly embedded member of the Bentford cult. I had his office located within the old servants' quarters, and so my players could gather that he is an avid hunter. Well, to my mind, the effect of Talib Zell's escape has caused most of the cult members it interacted with over the years to have their most dominant traits amplified. So, while many are trying to cut and run, Samuel has decided he is going to prowl the grounds with his rifle and his knife, hunting staff and intruder alike. When he detects the players amateurishly picking their way through the grounds that he has walked for decades, he just couldn't resist stalking them before picking his moment to strike, sniping at the players from the bushes. This led to a fun sequence of my players trying to locate, distract and flank Samuel before someone could get close enough to grapple him and bring him down. Again, this encounter is optional for you as keeper, and maybe you have better use in mind for Samuel Moran, but it tied in with me for explaining why the players hadn't been picked off by other security teams already. He's already, for the past day or so, been hunting them as well. Having overcome whichever obstacles you have placed in the way of your investigators, they should find themselves standing outside the doors of Bentford House, the manor at the centre of this mystery. As with so much of this scenario, the length of time that you allocate to exploring the manor and the danger level within can be elasticated to suit your ends. By this point in the adventure, my players were pretty dinged up, some carrying major wounds from encounters with the Phillipson brothers and Samuel Moran, and one nursing their sanity points as well after discovering the horrors within the old servants' quarters. After all this, they found Bentford House to be eerily quiet and abandoned. Well, almost abandoned, as the lord of the manor, Cyril Bentford, remains shut within the upper part of the building. Cyril is panicking, trying to contact the drowning apostle through an incomplete ritual using the body parts of a cult member that he murdered some days previously. The manor itself, unlike the old servants' quarters, is furnished with plenty of room descriptions, which I really appreciate, and it allows the players perhaps to glean a little of the history of the cult and the Bentford family. The players will by now know that the ritual Cyril is attempting will not work because he is not using Mournflower, and they should have collected some by now. Furthermore, even if successful, it won't contact Talib Zell, rather it will enable contact with its creator and jailer, the Stagnant Tribunal. Confronting Cyril will reveal him to be something of a pathetic spectacle, scrabbling in filth as he tries impotently to undo the damage and recapture the drowning apostle before any wrongdoing can be traced back to him. How the players deal with Cyril, who in this state may pose no threat, is up to them, although for the time being they both have a shared goal, and he can just collapse into a whining, self-serving heap, should you wish, as the investigators set up for the ritual and the climax of the adventure. The ritual itself is quite well described and open for embellishment to taste, and results in the investigators being brought before the Stagnant Tribunal itself in the form of 4 monolithic obelisks. Regardless of how much you expose your players to in this sequence, whether they are given a ready reception or are asked to prove themselves worthy of an audience, all that is key is that the Stagnant Tribunal is informed that the drowning apostle is free on Earth. This will immediately prompt them into action, banishing Talib Zell to the bottom of Bentford Lake again and returning the investigators whence they came. This concludes the scenario with the only way to achieve the, quote, good ending, unquote. Although any investigators who participated in the ritual will have to contend with the final sanity loss of dealing with a not-so-minor mythos entity. Overall, we found the scenario to be very enjoyable, as I said before, although it might suffer a little bit with a very slow burn start if you don't add in any little bits to spice it up yourself. To reiterate what I said in the non-spoiler section, the key to making this scenario stand out is to lean into the setting, and in the initial stages to make the players aware of the oppressive poverty of the carry and the toll it takes on the people who live there. The NPCs are, for the most part, trying to survive in a vicious world, even if it means turning to abuse and hurting others themselves. There are, however, some observations and even complaints I have about this scenario, and if you are considering trying in Dark and Lonely Waters, I hope the following points forewarn and even help you out. Firstly, be aware that if you stick to the encounters as written, it's entirely possible to complete this whole adventure successfully without encountering the drowning apostle even once. Certainly the entity's influence will be felt, but for me the scenario would lack something if the, main horror was not aware of your player's presence, let alone trying to hurt them or stop them. The drowning apostle is supposedly capable of manipulating standing bodies of water within its vicinity, so I added in some ideas of mine to add some moments in the earlier stages. For example, whilst driving to the scene of the drowning on Friday night, I had the rainfall pick up suddenly and start collecting on the windscreen. After a second or two, it coalesced into a flash glimpse of Taleb Zell and obscured the vision of the driver, prompting a drive auto roll to avoid sliding into a ditch. I also had the notion of causing a baby to choke on its own formula, but that opportunity never came up, for better or worse. At the culmination of the ritual on Sunday evening, I also added a thrashing vision of Taleb Zell being banished back to its watery lair, passing the investigators as their consciousness returns to their worldly bodies, going up. Lashing out, it tried to drag the unluckiest investigator down to join it as one last spiteful challenge at the end of the scenario. I don't know if these changes fly in the face of the author's intentions, and no offence is intended, I just thought it would be a good way to show that the investigator's actions had sent the horror packing. Another observation I noted throughout is that some of the sanity loss triggers within the scenario are a little tame compared to the usual fare. Again, this may be author intention, but if you are adding any additional scares in, then it might be worth downgrading the fishy statues in the church, for example, from sanity loss to just unpleasant observations. In terms of character information, I'm pleased to report you get ample background on the NPCs to roleplay them pretty well, and their statistics to boot, so happy there, along with lovely portraits that you've seen in this video. One thing I noted though is that a surprisingly large number of antagonistic NPCs have damage bonuses as a result of their characteristics, and this makes them uncommonly threatening against your average group of investigators. This extends even to the cowardly vicar, who supposedly comprises no physical threat, and Samuel Moran, who the players may even have been given a hint in advance, advising them that despite being a hunter, he will be vulnerable up close. I personally saved the damage bonuses for the more obvious physical threats in the scenario, for example the young Phillipson brothers, because even a modest damage bonus takes a strike from a medium threat up to something that's very likely to cause serious long-term damage, and there's simply insufficient time within the time constraints of this scenario to heal a major wound. One factor I noticed coming into the scenario and made plans for in advance was that I had concerns that my players would not feel sufficiently motivated to enter the Bentford estate on Sunday evening. Sure, they will be aware that something is wrong there, and Terry will implore them to look for Warren, but this may not be enough to encourage full-blown trespass at the risk of their own lives for players role-playing sensible people as opposed to RPG protagonists. As such, I prepared 4 additional motivations that I asked each of my players to draw one of as a secret extra beef they have with the residents of the Bentford estate, displayed on the screen now in case you wish to use them as inspiration for your sessions. Hopefully my review so far will give you some idea as to which parts of the scenario are essential for the players to have a chance of a successful resolution. It's going to be impossible for them to banish Taleb Zell if they don't obtain the book that Harlow Mulvaney stole from Lord Bentford, and the easiest way to do that is to have them find him, bearing in mind that he is currently hiding from a police search operation. That said, periodic spot hidden rolls in the carry might see the investigators spot him as he furtively leaves warning for the residents in graffiti. Then they can either chase or tail him back to his hideout. Your players will need to understand the need for Mournflower come the final ritual, lest annoying backtracking spoil the flow of the adventure. So yes, with the extensive backstory provided, there is substantial latitude you can give your players, but try to avoid them from feeling rudderless by having them notice frequent missing posters mentioning Harlow, and even police grumbling about why is he so important to the Bentfords that half the force is out searching for him, so they realise he's a bigger part of the mystery than they may have already realised. The above are not necessarily complaints, but opportunities I had to make the game better suited to my players. The best indicator as to whether I felt this adventure was worthwhile is that if a sequel or another scenario is published within this same estate, would I buy it? And my answer is absolutely. My players and I grew up in the 80s as children and revelled in the setting and would gladly return. Admittedly, I picked this adventure up on sale, although I would pay full price for this product. I will put a link in the description below to the scenario on DriveThruRPG and can gladly recommend it to those keepers looking for a mythos threat in a plausible modern setting. There's plenty more in here that I haven't had a chance to cover, so don't feel like I've shown you everything that In Dark and Lonely Waters has to offer. Please let me know if you enjoyed this review or found it useful and would like to see me cover other scenarios that I've run. I can't promise anything like regularity, but it's nice to produce something every now and again. I'm Shieldwall100, and I'll see you next time.